Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I am your host, Rob Port. A little bit later in the show, incoming U.S. Attorney Drew Wrigley joins me to talk about, well, the confirmation process that he went through, which took a really long time. He had some interesting things to say about that. Also, what his approach to this office is going to be. He's going to be North Dakota's top federal law enforcement officer. And not only the routine things that we expect law enforcement to do, there's the ongoing issues with the opioids and law enforcement and everything else. I mean, everybody, that's I don't want to say that crimes are run of the mill, but I mean, let's face it, that's their day-to-day job of that office. But also, I mean, there's some interesting policy questions to ask because states like North Dakota are increasingly legalizing marijuana to one degree or another. Medical marijuana is already legal in North Dakota. In the next election cycle, we're going to have another debate, as we did last cycle, about recreational marijuana. So as somebody who is in charge with enforcing federal law under which marijuana continues to be illegal, despite states like North Dakota legalizing marijuana to one degree or another, the federal ban on marijuana hasn't stopped. So he had some interesting things to say about that. But before we get there, I want to talk about the mayor of Minot. He's a gentleman by the name of Sean Sitma. Now, I live in Minot, and I know Sean, and I think Sean's a nice guy generally and a good guy. But recently there was a debate about people call it a lot of different things. I've always called it extraterritorial zoning. Now, what this is, and I don't like it even one little bit, but what it is it's the process through which a local government, like the city of Minot, can extend their regulatory powers beyond their borders. So for things like, for instance, and that's what this story is going to deal with, building permits, the city of Minot can extend their building codes out beyond city limits and then enforce them and charge you fees and things like that. Now, the problem for that might all be fine, but the problem comes in the fact that we have some concepts in this country, like, and we throw these terms around a lot, and I always get super interested when we can take some of these high-minded things we say about government in the United States of America, and we can funnel them down to where the rubber meets the road, actual practical policy considerations, specifically at the local level. Now, you've probably heard the term the consent of the governed. Another term that you probably remember from grade school when you were studying the American Revolution was no taxation without representation. Now, these two terms are different ways, I think, of saying the same thing, which is essentially is, if you're going to govern me, I need to have a say in that, right? I need to have a say in who's going to govern me. I need to have a say in how I'm going to be governed. That's essentially what the American formulation of democracy is all about. Now, I realize there's some cranks out there who like to well, America's not a democracy. America's not a direct democracy. That's true. America has a representative sort of democracy generally. Now, we do some elements of direct democracy. For instance, we do the initiated measures that I'm constantly complaining about. I don't really like them. That's an example of direct democracy. But for the most part, in the United States of America, we elect people and then we're governed by those people. Right. So we elect a governor. We elect various executive branch offices. We elect, legislative branch offices. Heck, in the state, we even elect judicial branch offices. So, we are governed by these people and we have a say in governing them. Right. And so if they're doing things that we don't like, the voters have recourse. We can not elect them. We can vote for somebody else next time. We can even recall them, right? We even have a recall process in North Dakota where if you don't like what an elected official is doing, and by the way, as much as I don't like initiated measures, I do like recalls. If a given politician, a state lawmaker, or I don't know, even the governor is not doing what you like, well, there's a process. You can collect signatures, you can put the issue, you can put them back on the ballot and hold another election even before their term is up. I like all of those things. Those are good things. And it's what contributes to what is generally a very pacific way of life for us in North Dakota and the United States of America. Because as much as we all get frustrated with the political process sometimes, as much as we all get frustrated with the legislature, we get very cynical about it sometimes. At the end of the day, we can all say, well, listen, we're involved in the process. We voted for these people. If we don't like the way they're governing us, well, we're partly to blame because we had a say in who is governing us. But this brings me to the extraterritorial zoning question. people in extraterritorial zones don't get to vote for city governments. That's right. The city of Minot, for instance, and this is where this came up. There was a woman, and this has been widely reported, so I'm going to use her name, but a woman by the name of Patty Eisenzimmer. She's not a citizen of Minot. She lives in rural Minot. She lives in what's called the extraterritorial zoning area. And she is being charged double for building permits what somebody in the city of Minot would pay for. She didn't like this. So she went to the city council. She asked for them to change it. City council said, no, we're not going to change it. They justify double charging her for the building permits because the city says, well, we have to go through the expense of providing those services, right? And so, and because this is outside of Minot, now, listen, we're talking about miles outside of Minot, not like hundreds of miles, right? It's not like these people are traveling across the state, to do these building inspections. No, it's a few miles outside of Minot. It's typically where the extraterritorial zone is. But they're saying, well, there's an additional expense to providing, the building inspection services in this area. So that's why they're justified in charging double. Now, after Eisenzimmer went to to the city council, they opted not to change the policy. She got a hold of some lawmakers, and lo and behold, House Bill 1471 has passed the legislature and been signed into law by Governor Doug Burgum. It was introduced by State Representative Dan Ruby, who's a Minot area lawmaker, and it's all a good thing, except Mayor Sean Sitma, well, he doesn't like it. This is what he said in a statement released when House Bill 1471 passed. He said, I quote, "We're deeply disappointed by the sole action of Representative Dan Ruby for making this local control matter a state issue." Now, I should add here, this was not the sole action of Representative Dan Ruby. This was introduced in the House of Representatives. It passed there with majorities. It was then went over to the the state Senate, where it also passed with a majority, and then it was signed into law by Governor Doug Burgum, the head of the executive branch. So the idea that this was the sole action of Representative Dan Ruby is, well, a little silly. He then continued, and he said, I quote, "As was explained to the legislature, the city subsidizes its planning and building permits fees with property taxes. Those in the ETA," that's his term for the extraterritorial zone, "don't pay property taxes, so the city imposed a surcharge to make up the cost difference. It was simply a reasonable effort to make sure the cost of our government is paid for by those who access and utilize our services." Now, what he's making it sound like there is that the folks in the extraterritorial zone are coming to the city for business and are then, thus requesting that they get away with something that, put one over on the city. But here's the thing. The people who decided to create the extraterritorial zone is the city of Minot, right? So the city of Minot took their zoning and their regulation beyond the city limits and created the extraterritorial zone where people actually live. And now they're out there double charging, at least for building permits, the people who live in that zone. And why wouldn't they? Right? Because here's the thing. He's making it sound like, oh, these people, they don't pay property taxes to the city. Right. They paid property taxes to the county. They don't pay property taxes to the city. So we're just trying to, make sure that we're fairly reimbursed, for the services that we provide. Well, here's the thing. If you don't want to provide the services out there, then don't provide them. Get rid of the extraterritorial zone and leave those people alone. But if you're going to have the extraterritorial zone, how in the world can we let politicians get away with double charging people who can't vote for them, right? Because that's what's really going on here. If you're gonna stick it to a group of people and you're a politician, why wouldn't you stick it to the group of people who can't vote in the elections in which you're elected? It's kind of a nifty deal, right? The city needs some money. Well, we'll double charge the people who can't vote for us. But that runs against those concepts that we were talking about, right? The consent of the governed, no taxation without representation. Now, this is happening in the city of Minot, but I'll tell you, extraterritorial zones aren't unique to Minot. They're happening all over the place. When I published my story about Minot, I had people from Bismarck reaching out, saying that they've run into some problems there as well. And you've got to wonder how this is even legal. Like why are we even allowing this sort of extraterritorial zoning? Local governments will tell you it's because they need to plan ahead, right? Because, Minot grows, other communities, they grow and they get bigger, and eventually they're going to expand into these areas, and they want to ensure that if they annex an area, that the things done there in terms of, utilities or building or whatever are done in a standard where it can be easily integrated into the city at a future time, which, okay, I guess that makes sense. But how do you get around the fact that you're regulating people who can't vote for you? You're making rules for people who can't vote for you. You're, charging them fees, charging them money, and they can't vote for you. It might be harder. It might make planning harder, but I don't think that we can undermine, again, basic comments of the basic tenets of the American system of government, like the consent of the governed, just for the sake of the expediency of local government. I think we can aspire to something better. My interview with Drew Wrigley, up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Drew Wrigley joins me now. I guess a lot of times when you read about Drew Wrigley in the newspaper, you hear him described as a former U.S. attorney, but he's not going to be a former U.S. attorney much longer. You're not quite in office yet. I know the news broke that you are going to be our U.S. attorney, but there's still a couple of formalities yet, Drew, that got to be done before you're actually in office.
I guess that's right, Rob. Thanks for the opportunity. Hello to you and your listeners. I was confirmed last week. The president appointed me or nominated me in 2018. I was confirmed by the U.S. Senate unanimously last week, and now I'm told that once the president signs the commission, I can be sworn in immediately and begin work. So hopefully that'll happen yet in the next couple of days.
So no getting coffee in the break room yet until you're officially sworn in. Is that how it works? No donuts or coffee or anything like that?
Yeah, donuts and coffee, right? Yeah, it's going to take another day or so, but I'm really eager to start and anxious to get back to that work. I guess really I'll be extending what is already a 15-year career in law enforcement, both a little over 5 years as a DA in Philly, and then over 8 years as the U.S. attorney here in North Dakota previously. It's a tremendous honor. I'm honored by the president's nomination and grateful for the strong support of Senator Hoeven and Senator Kramer, and anxious to move forward and work with the tremendous staff here and all the great folks in federal, state, local, tribal law enforcement across the state and region. Rob, it's a privilege, and I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I know you're looking forward to it. The process though took a long time, and this is something I know Senator Kevin Kramer has commented on it. He has called for reform in how we do these confirmations. You're certainly not the only person who's been held up. No. I mean, it's been a real struggle. Frankly, it's partisan politics. But as somebody who is freshly through the process, and I know you're anxious to get started on the actual job that you were nominated for, and you probably don't have a lot of, after spending all this time, thinking about it and watching the process play out, you're probably pretty fed up with talking about that. But just tell us about that process as somebody who's just been through it.
Well, when I went through this in 2001, we had two Democrat United States senators and a Democrat Senate, and I had to get to know Senator Conrad and Senator Dorgan, and it was a very positive interaction with them, and they eventually supported my nomination, said so publicly, and helped move me through the process, and I remain grateful to this very day. I was confirmed about a year after first nominated, and that's pretty typical because there's an extensive background check, financial vet, personal, background check, all the stuff that they go through, and then it's got to make its way. So a year is pretty typical from when you first make it known that you're interested in the job to when you can hope to be confirmed. This go around, it's obviously well documented in all the national news that the background or that the confirmation process has slowed to the point where, as you mentioned, Senator Kramer and others are talking about it publicly, that it's a need for reform. And that's, I'll leave that to the politicians to figure out how they're going to do it. But having just gone through the process, I think it does bear mentioning. You get through it all, and by the time you get to the committee, it's dragging along the process, not just for me, but for, scores of nominees as it goes along. And they keep telling you it's not personal, but at some point it's impacting you personally and your family, but also more importantly, the work of these offices that you're being nominated to lead. And so I look back on that and I think, well, it bears mentioning that you get to the end of the process. And there is they have the Judiciary Committee. They don't have hearings for U.S. attorneys. You don't physically appear and answer questions. That doesn't happen for anyone and never has, that I've ever been aware of ever. But they go through and they have a hearing on you. And by then they've already discussed your nomination, everything else. So mine went through without any opposition. It was done in about 15 seconds. They had already reviewed my background. I had interviewed with the lawyers on representative of the Democrats and the Republicans, answered any questions that they had. And so it went through in about 15 seconds, no opposition. Then it makes it to the Senate floor, and by the time it goes through, in the end, it goes through unanimously, no opposition. And that's been raised by a lot of people as you get to the end of this. And these are not truly controversial nominations; they just get slowed down in the process. As I said, I'm leaving. That's for the politicians to figure out. But it took about 18 months this time around from when I was identified. I got a call. Mentioned this, but the day after I was confirmed last week, Rod Rosenstein called me, the deputy AG. He and I are old friends from when we were U.S. attorneys before under President Bush, and he called and we kind of chuckled. He said, "Drew, not bad, 18 months." And I laughed, and that was when I interviewed with him, and Jeff Sessions was the Attorney General at the time. They had a positive reaction. We had a nice discussion, and 2 days later, I was notified by the White House that they were going to go forward with my background check, financial check, all the things that they do for the folks that they've identified as the person they're intending to nominate. And that was now quite some while ago. So yeah, it takes some time, but you know what? It's one of those things. Now I just move forward, and that's behind me and behind everybody. I'm really anxious to, as I said before, re-engage in the work of the office, working with the incredible professionals there that do such a tremendous job, and I'm anxious to have the privilege of leading them again.
Well, I know you don't want to comment on the politics of it, and I don't want to drill on this, but I mean, 18 months. That's a long time. And I'm thinking it's not just, I mean, we look at our federal judge situation here in North Dakota. I mean, we had one of our judges when he announced that he was going to be going on senior status later this year. At that point, we had one judge who actually got appointed to a higher court. The other judge saying he's going on senior status. At that point, we had no judges nominated or in place to replace either of them. I mean, that process. Now we have Peter Welty, who has been nominated. So, but at that time, we were months away from having no federal judges in North Dakota. I mean, at some point, Drew, I got to think, you said that your process wasn't controversial. Well, that's because most of this is the president's allowed to pick who he wants to pick. Congress vets him to make sure, is this person a criminal? Is this person a member of the Ku Klux Klan or something? I mean, is there something? I mean, outside of those obvious red flags, the governor should just get to hire who he wants to hire to work in his administration, right? I mean, at some point,
it's president. Yeah, I mean, it's important. I mean, you think about the heads of the U.S. attorney's offices. These are not individual DA's offices from around the country. There's a unified federal approach to law enforcement on behalf of the administration that is selected by the American people. That's why you have presidentially appointed United States attorneys. And I'm the privileged to be the 19th in state history, and I was the 17th as well. And that's a privilege, and it's one I take seriously. And that's why I say I just leave the politics to someone else. But the 18 months, to be fair, I mean, it took a year after I was identified by that process before I was formally nominated. And again, there's all sorts of things that go on with the politics behind the scenes. And then the president formally nominated me in August of 2018. And here we are. Someday I'll write a booklet on what that process was like. I mean, I only say it's behind me because that's factual. It's just, you got to move forward. About the judgeships and everything else around the country, I think you see a seriousness of purpose, though, on behalf of the Senate. What's going to be happening now? They've made some rule changes and doing different things to try to move the process along, because these are, although they're political appointments, I say that's political in the very best sense of the word. And the American public gets to select their president. The president then gets to make these appointments. Lifetime tenure for judges, the duration of the administration for these other positions, or serve at the will of the president, more to the point. And they've got to be able to carry that out so the will of the public can be carried out. when you have courtrooms across this country where you're scrambling for judges and you're trying to get these people in place, and that could be a real crisis for the litigants and the people are trying to move civil and criminal cases through. So, I applaud the efforts of anyone who's trying to make sure that our courtrooms are fully staffed around the United States. And I'll leave it at that. I now have been through this process twice. Like I said, I like telling the stories about Senator Conrad and Senator Dorgan. We're both just complete gentlemen about the entire process. And not only that, but across my tenure, two of the first phone calls I got when I announced that I was stepping down were from Senator Dorgan and Senator Conrad, and I appreciate that to this day. So it can work out in the very best ways sometimes as well. And this time I just greatly appreciate Senator Hoeven and then Congressman Kramer, now Senator Kramer, have just been steadfast in their support. I think my record of law enforcement across 15 years, including my 8 years as the U.S. Attorney, formed a foundation for my opportunity to serve again, and I'm privileged to do so.
One last question about the nomination process, then I want to get into what some of your thoughts are for how you're going to approach this job that you have now. Behind the scenes, Senator Kramer has certainly indicated that something was going on behind the scenes to hold up your nomination, that there was some politics at play, and I think that's the genesis for a lot of his calls for reform. What can you tell us about that, if anything? And again, I know you're trying to put this, you got a job ahead of you now, you just want to get out there and do that job, but what can you tell us about that?
Well, there's nothing I'm going to talk about at this point in that regard. It's like I say, it's behind me. I'm not trying to be coy about it, but there's a well-established record about what happened there. And again, I'm gratified I got through with unanimous support last week of the United States Senate, and unanimous support of Democrats and Republicans on the Judiciary Committee before that, unanimous support of the lawyers on behalf of Senator Feinstein and Senator Grassley when Senator Grassley was still the chair of the committee. And every step of the way, I appreciated the support of the Attorney General and Deputy AG when I interviewed with them in the summer of 2017. And I'm tremendously appreciative of the President's confidence that he's placed in me by making the nomination. And now that I've been confirmed, I'm anxious to serve in the administration. And, it's an exciting time up ahead.
Tell us about coming into an office. Like we said, 18 months it took. We've had an acting U.S. Attorney, Chris Myers, and I know you've been very complimentary of him. But he didn't put himself in for the job. He didn't put himself in for. He didn't want that.
Well, no, if people need to understand, there's always an acting. These are presidential appointments, but when the presidentially appointed U.S. Attorney leaves office, the person who's acting as the first assistant automatically becomes the attorney, the acting United States Attorney, and that's just, you have to have continuity, and then eventually a president appoints someone else. And I hired Chris as an assistant U.S. Attorney many years ago. He's a very capable prosecutor. And so, he's a career person. And when I took office last time, here's a good for instance. When I took office last time as U.S. Attorney, there had been a long-term interim acting U.S. Attorney, and Lynn Crooks, and that's a well-known name around the country and in this region. Obviously, Lynn had been the first assistant under John Schneider, my predecessor, who then John had to resign because of health concerns, and he eventually passed away. And so Lynn served as quite some time. I don't know if it was a year or two before. And then also there was a time back when Judge Rodney Webb, got appointed he was U.S. Attorney, got appointed to the federal bench. And there were 3 or 4 years there where Gary Anier served. He had been the first assistant. He automatically became the U.S. Attorney when Rod Webb resigned to become a judge. And Gary served for 3 or 4 years. So it's not an uncommon thing. And more important, this happens. There are 93 of these districts around the country. This happens routinely. There's nothing different about that in any district. And someday when my term is up, or when I'm no longer serving as the U.S. Attorney, whoever is the first assistant at that time will automatically become the U.S. Attorney until such time as a new presidential appointee comes in, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. They will have their choice. It's interesting. When I stepped down before, the Obama administration came along, and it took them quite some while to identify who they wanted to nominate, and you're behind the scenes things there too, I suppose. But eventually they nominated Tim Purdon, who I don't know him any better today than I knew him then. But I remember I wrote, I think as I recall, I was the only public official to then write a public column calling for his confirmation. He was getting some criticism. He had been very involved. I think he was a member of the Democrat National Committee or something, and had only been a defense lawyer and never been a prosecutor. And people were complaining, and I thought, that's not the way this works. The president gets to make his and someday her selection in this regard, and they just need to be a qualified person. You can't dictate that it had to be a prosecutor. I had been a prosecutor, but others hadn't, and so I called publicly for him to be confirmed, because that was President Obama's right to make that choice.
I was one of the people saying that maybe it was a little too, because straight from the Democratic National Committee is a little, but we don't need to relitigate that.
Yeah.
But I guess my point in bringing that up, though, was, are there any challenges, and again, not intending this is why I brought up your praise for Chris Myers, not intending this as any sort of a criticism of him at all. Are there challenges to being a presidential appointee, taking over for an interim U.S. attorney after 18 months?
Nope, and not just because I know the staff very well, personally and professionally, but just because, no, there aren't. The Department of Justice is structured that way. That's why I went into that long dissertation on this is what happens in every office across the country. There are interim acting United States attorneys that are either there for a couple of months or very often the case longer, a year or years. And so, no, the department is structured for that. And I'm anxious. One of my first orders of business when I start here in the next days will be to spend many hours in the weeks ahead meeting individually with every member of the staff, attorney and non-attorney, sit down and talk with them about the office, where things are, where they are professionally, what some of their thoughts about, moving forward, and really getting back in touch with the day-to-day work of the office. Also, those same kinds of meetings with the other law enforcement stakeholders, federal, state, local, tribal, all across the state of North Dakota. I'm very well familiar with that process. It's obviously something that I spent time doing when I was lieutenant governor for 6 years as well. So I'm anxious to do that. That's the first order of business, though, getting back in direct contact with the folks in the office, understanding the immediate needs of the office, resource-wise, personnel-wise. There's several openings in the office that I'm anxious to start my process for hiring attorney and non-attorney staff. And those are rudimentary. I said this when I was stepping down before, Rob. When I stepped down as U.S. attorney before, I said, 85% of the work in this office no one ever knows about, and it's some of the most rewarding work that I found in my 8 years before, because it's the day-to-day stuff that is impacting law enforcement and public safety in our state and our region, and I can say even in our country. So I'm looking forward to that.
Obviously, you're transitioning into office. Like you said, you're getting up to speed with everybody and all of that stuff. In terms of law enforcement priorities that your office is responsible for coming in, what's the pressing needs? What are you going to be focused on?
Well, I that's one of the things I'm anxious to get versed on, some of the investigations that are ongoing right now and what's up ahead. But obviously, the names of the narcotics change, every so many years. When I was in office before, methamphetamine was what was being discussed publicly, and for good reason. We had an enormous number of very large scale, national, international trafficking cases in methamphetamine, which is still the predominant narcotic being transported around this region and used, but there's more talk about opioids. And so, fill in the blank on what the narcotic of the day, week, month, year is, but it is a top priority of federal law enforcement to impose law enforcement efforts on traffickers, people who are moving large quantities of narcotics in and around and through our region. And I'm anxious to get reengaged in that work. And obviously violent crime and financial crime in Indian country and elsewhere. In Indian country, we have a special trust responsibility. The federal government is predominantly responsible for law enforcement in Indian country, and I'm anxious to pick up those reins again and talk with tribal leadership on their individual challenges and needs that are up ahead. And as I look back on my 15 years, both as an assistant DA in one of America's most violent cities, Philadelphia, I was there for over 5 years. I spent time in the major trials unit, the rape and sexual assault unit, and tried many hundreds of serious felony cases, and had that as my background, not to mention my years here before. I think prepares me very, very well to meet the needs of the state and the region. So, we'll be talking about that a lot in the month ahead, about, articulating publicly those priorities for this Department of Justice, and I'd speak nationally about that, and then how they dovetail in with the needs here in our state and region.
Two more questions, and then I'll let you go, because I know you're a busy man transitioning into this office. First is, you mentioned the law enforcement priority, obviously drugs, opioids, things like that. North Dakota is, like a lot of other states, a state that is looking at increasingly legalizing marijuana. We had a debate about recreational marijuana, at the ballot box last cycle. That failed, but the voters did pass, and the legislature has implemented medical marijuana laws. we're struggling with some of that. In fact, we just had an issue with in this legislative session with language that would turn over the list of medical marijuana license holders to state law enforcement for the purposes of saying, hey, you may have a problem because marijuana is still illegal at the federal level, and that may impact gun ownership or concealed carry or things like that. So. As basically a top federal cop, how do you deal with a situation where states like North Dakota are, in a way, sort of disobeying federal law on marijuana? How do you handle that? How do you approach that in your office?
I'm glad you actually asked that question, Rob. I think it is one of the pressing needs. It's one of the brilliant parts of our republic, right? You've got the states that have their own priorities that they set forward, and it's a patchwork. And we're working in a totally different era from when I was here before because of what you just articulated. It's one where I'm going to get a strong sense of how the administration wants us to be dealing with state stakeholders in that regard and what we think are federal priorities, how they dovetail in with the local needs. And I'm not trying to avoid the question, just to say this. I'll promise you and your listeners, anyone who remembers my time in office as U.S. Attorney before knows that I'm accessible, I'm transparent, and accountable. At the end of the day, I'll be talking about these issues. Once I have some of those meetings with the state and the federal people who are most directly impacted by that, I'll always be there to answer the questions with people about how we're going to proceed. But I'm not prepared to do that today. But you've got my personal cell number. I dare say every reporter in the state who's covered me before has it and will have it. I won't block anybody's number. People can always reach me. Whether I can comment or not, it will depend on the moment, but I don't hide it under my desk. I will always be there to answer questions. And that's a dicey issue. Let's be honest. It's complicated, but it's an important one. The public has an evolving sentiment on the issue. I think it's fair to say. And so as a result, there's going to have to be a political and professional and law enforcement working through period. And so I'm anxious to be part of that, frankly.
Last question. You just alluded there to needing, obviously some guidance from your boss in the Trump administration about how to handle that issue. Have they given you any directives so far? I mean, obviously you've been through a process. They confirmed you. I mean, have they given you any just philosophical guidance or just this is how we want these issues approached? Or what have they told you on how to do your job so far?
No, they haven't along those lines. It was interesting in the process, having been, maybe it was because I had been U.S. Attorney before and had been a prosecutor in a very busy, pretty dangerous city before. Maybe it changed the process a little bit. But when I was interviewing with the different panels that you interview with at the Department of Justice, and then eventually with the Attorney General Sessions and the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, they were really asking me those questions. I think trying to figure out, they know what they were about. They know how they want to proceed on things. And I think that they wanted to get a sense of my view on, a host of different law enforcement issues. And I was the same way, same words I just used with you. I was transparent and open, and I feel accountable for it. I've always been accountable for my record, and I'm willing to talk about the work that we've done both before as U.S. Attorney and then also, as we go forward now. I think I tell people in the office all the time, they'll remember this. We're paid by the public. That means we have to be willing to articulate what it is we're doing and why we're prioritizing what we are, why other things aren't being prioritized maybe. And then, we get assessed as a part of that. But it's an important thing to recognize that every U.S. Attorney's office is an extension of the Department of Justice, the National Department of Justice, which is put in place in no attenuated way. It's put in place by the American public. And so I'm anxious to do that work up ahead. And like I said, when it's functioning well, the Department of Justice dovetails that in with local and regional needs too. And I know I'm confident that that's going to be part of it too. So it's incumbent upon me to be in touch with those matters really, really well in North Dakota and help communicate them to the national leadership. And I will.
Drew, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
That's it for the Plain Talk Podcast. Remember, new episodes come out Monday through Friday, right away in the morning, so you can listen pretty much whenever you want. If you have any feedback on the show, and I've been getting feedback. I actually had a listener on Twitter yesterday tell me that he likes it when I do the commentaries at the beginning of the show as opposed to just having two back-to-back interviews, which I really appreciated that feedback. I'll tell you why sometimes we do that is I try to keep these shows in, the 30 to 45 minute range. This is a daily show. It's a lot of content, and I don't want to overwhelm people. So sometimes if I have a couple of interviews booked for the day, we'll just do the interviews instead of the commentary. But I appreciate the feedback. If you have feedback, you can email at any time, rob@sayanythingblog.com, or get a hold of me on social media. I'm at Rob Port on Twitter. You can find me if you just search Facebook for Rob Port. I'm not that hard to find. Say Anything Blog has a Twitter and Facebook profile as well. You can find that. The Say Anything Blog accounts are basically just the content, just the podcast and the political stuff. My personal accounts are, well, they're personal, so you might see some random pictures of my kids or maybe me griping about baseball. You never know. Also, if you're listening to this podcast, and I appreciate everybody who's done so far, if you're listening to this podcast on a platform that allows you to rate or review, if you would leave an honest rating and an honest review, each one goes a long way towards helping other people find this podcast. All the different algorithms out there and everything, the more ratings we get, particularly positive ratings, but I'm just asking you for your honest ratings. The more we get, the better. So if you would do that for me, I would appreciate it. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.